I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast Year in Review Podcast, our final podcast of the year.
It's funny because this wasn't really our intention in the beginning.
Technical issues.
Yeah.
Good news. We have switched over our podcast format, so you can now binge on all of our many past episodes. Rob, I think some of those podcasts were actually recorded on a gramophone, if I
believe they
remember
sound like it. No, I think in the beginning, I know in the beginning. I say that like I don't remember. In the beginning, we were just recording.
After all that beer, it's hard to remember
all that,
sometimes.
2 sips. Anyway, but we were recording.
No, I was talking about the years and years of beer that we've consumed on this
beer.
podcast.
You can tell what kind of beer we were drinking based on the level of incoherence in the podcast. We used to record into a laptop mic. And you can tell we recorded into a laptop mic.
Do you remember the USB mic that plugged in and also was a store?
Yes.
I just ran across that in my house where I keep electronics. Yeah,
that's
that was
the
bad.
electronic version of a tin can and string. That was rough. Huge thank you to those of the listeners who were listening to us back then and didn't give up.
Pretty much my wife. Your wife doesn't listen to this podcast.
Not regularly, no. Of course, I don't listen to many of her things on coding. So anyway, we're even.
Yeah.
But no, in fact, when we this is back to the technical issue. Our original plan was to release our most recent podcast on Dumu on Christmas Eve. It was scheduled and everything, and because of the switch we made, it went out early.
Yeah.
And we'd given everybody instructions about, hey, if you don't get a podcast from us on the 24th, something is wrong.
So Santa is now delivering.
Santa is delivering, or we're delivering, because there is no Santa, Lee.
Rob, I mean, you are sitting in my lap.
Never. Not for all the money.
The weather outside is frightful.
Man, I hate that song. Have I ever told you how much I hate like 98% of Christmas music? Oh my gosh.
That's why I chose that song.
I know. So anyway, but yeah, year in review. We were talking about what to do and realized, a lot of stuff has gone on this year.
Yeah.
So at the risk of sounding
in the world and in the podcast.
Yeah, and at the risk of sounding self-indulgent, we thought let's break this year down in the podcast as well.
And we should point out to the listener that, we're recording this on the 23rd of December, and it's going to go out on the 24th of December. But we oftentimes, when we make the podcast, we'll record an episode, and then sometimes we have posted podcasts years afterwards. Do you remember that one that we posted earlier this year that was on like the yellow shirt? Like it was during the
the Gilets Jaunes,
the Gilets Jaunes
in
movement.
France.
Yeah, and so like in some early 2020, there's just this reference to Gilets Jaunes.
I remember
and it's
that. Yeah. So, but it's been an interesting year because we've had quite the switch in focus.
Yeah, Rob, you didn't start out this year here in Eugene, Oregon, did you?
I was in China. I was there when it all started.
You were in Tianjin.
I was in Tianjin.
You went to Tianjin in October before COVID was in existence.
Yeah, we were there. We were there a couple of months. Had really just gotten our feet under us. Really made friends, connections. One of my sons was going to a little school nearby, Chinese school.
Is that a URUN or something?
It was like a URUN. Okay. It was a privately run URUN, kindergarten kind of thing for the non-Chinese speakers. When COVID first hit in China, where we were, our first thought was, man, people are really overreacting.
Yeah.
Because my experience in China in the past was that people overreacted. Perhaps not fair, but that's just my memory.
It's a very Proustian thing.
Very Proust. I should put that in there. I'm not cutting that out. We're leaving that in. Rememory. I'm gonna coin a new term. We ended up leaving pretty quickly.
Yeah, I actually was on a call with you. You called me via WeChat. At some point in February, and I remember being in one of my basement offices.
Yep.
And we had this long conversation, and I was like, Rob, if you don't think this is right for your family, y'all should leave. But it kind of sounds like it's okay, and China's getting a hand on it, and you were like, yeah, I think we're going to stick around. 18 hours later, I get an email from you.
Yeah, we're out. Well, and it's funny because, the confinement is interesting because being confined in a giant city with no real parks is a very different thing than being confined in a place like Eugene, right? Yeah. Where you can go for a walk, you can go out to the forest, you can drive to the coast as long as you're not hanging out with a ton of people, In Tianjin, ton of people that's everything. That's the little 2 meter by 2 meter grocery store thing 50 meters from your house. I mean, And so very quickly became clear that, okay, the only person who's going to win here is me, because I'll have plenty of time to work on my dissertation. My wife and kids are going to be in a tiny apartment for the next who knows how long.
And this was in February when it wasn't. I mean, it was clear China was getting a hand on things, but it wasn't clear exactly how
there was
it was
a crackdown, big time, and that was the other scary thing. Is I mean, at the time we couldn't even leave our apartment complex without like a little passport document thing. Anyway, came back, and it's been an interesting year since, obviously, for the rest of the world, but also for the podcast. I wonder sometimes we've shifted more in format to series.
Yeah, we because Laszlo Montgomery, who has the China History podcast, which is I think both of our favorite podcasts.
One of them anyway.
Yeah. He does a lot of series, and he does a really good job. And we were inspired by him to try and kind of take up that format, and it's been pretty good, right? We did a Pusong Ling podcast series and
3-part thing, and most recently Not Made in China.
Yeah, and next year we actually have a podcast series coming up.
We have a couple of biggies coming up.
Biggie, ooh.
Yeah, starting in January.
That's not Biggie Smalls, is it?
It's not, because he's dead. But we started.
But to be fair, our podcast has no money and no problems.
That is very true. That is very, very true. Yeah. January we're starting up with our biggest series we've ever attempted, which is a 10-part series. Every decade of the 20th century, we're going to break down based on the writer we feel exemplifies.
You and I are going to choose dueling writers.
Except for one decade.
That's right.
You and I agree on one decade in the 20th century.
That much?
Only
we agree
one.
on one thing?
So people should stay tuned for that. But no, and it's been interesting in a lot of ways because, one of the things that switched us over to doing series was, A, we just frankly are in the same place and can really work on something. Yeah. But B, taking kind of a sober look around at the world of academia and the job market and going, you know what? It might behoove us, isn't that a great word, to do a little more with the podcast than we've been doing. For the listener who's not in academia, like every other field of employment, not a lot out there right now. Lee and I have both applied for stuff. I very quickly looked at the stuff that was out there and went, I don't want this, or this, and there's no way I can get this. And some people were like, that's very pessimistic. I'm like, I was told as much by a professor I know. They were like, yeah, don't even apply for that. That's, whatever.
For me, I mean, so academia is fantastic. And for those of y'all thinking of a career in academia, you should definitely send us an email and we'd love to talk to you. For me, academia allows for me to just kind of submerge myself in this discipline that I really, really love. And it's fantastic. You get to read so much. It's so cool that someone paid us to do a lot of reading and a lot of writing. It's a real treat. The question I have right now and I struggle with is going forward with COVID decimating a lot of university budgets. How many jobs are there going to be? I think we're actually, Rob, you and I are actually in better places compared with other humanists, just because. Sure. Even though COVID has I think the decimation of COVID, we're going to see an end to it in the next couple of years. But the sort of Cold War developing between China and the U.S. really leaves us in actually a more powerful position in terms of comparatively compared to our colleagues in the English department who are just they're in a lot worse situation.
Depending on your perspective, because there's actually, looking at the job postings, there's a whole lot more in English departments right now than in
that may be true, but per capita, right? Like how many people are graduating from English departments versus how many people even speak Chinese?
Yeah, and you and I were
academia.
talking about this right beforehand, but I'm not nearly as gung-ho about academia because what I'm seeing is a lot of departments moving away from the kind of scholarship that I would want to do.
Which is?
I do not want to feel like I have to do my research within within the bounds of whatever's sort of new, cutting edge, because new and cutting edge for me in the humanities is not mean as much as in other fields. This is not particle physics, right?
I think you're onto something there. There is this kind of jargon-laced methodological trendiness in humanities that is really sometimes repelling. I personally think one of the problems that the humanities has is that a lot of humanists don't feel like their existence is justified. They feel like everybody in the world knows the importance of science. Everybody in society goes, "Oh yeah, I have an iPhone, and science brought me that."
Mm-hmm.
And there is no need to justify the existence of a big science department at a state university. But you can't. There is no iPhone for the humanist, right? And I think that we have to do a better job of justifying ourselves. I think the justification for humanities is there, right? Right. Like, can you think of any point in the past year where you've really thought, man, my political leaders have done a really poor job of communicating, or they're morons who have absolutely no critical thinking skills?
But
I'll just leave that, to
clearly
you.
Not. No, but I think what's interesting about that though is this is kind of my point. One of the things that keeps me from going, man, I want to get a university post somewhere, is that, and you and I have already experienced this in grad school. A whole lot of departments across the humanities are moving away from any kind of real training in writing and argumentation. The assumption is, hey, you're in grad school, you can clearly do this. Well, not really. You and I have both read, hey, we've written papers that were garbage,
I think everything I've written is garbage.
Yeah, well, I would go, when I read, one of the fun things in grad school is to read stuff you wrote in your first year. Wow, It's bad. Anyway, but what I see is an attempt to kind of increase awareness of departments by offering the new and the cool, So, but what for me validates a lot of the humanities has nothing to do with new and cool.
It's the old that really validates
stuff. I mean,
humanities.
Regardless of what you feel about something like a canon, the idea of saying, look, we should just stop
canon.
teaching.
CANON, not
Yes.
CANNON.
And it would be a very interesting department if we had both. But the idea that, we should just teach kind of totes whatevs, you tend to lose some people in the process.
So in museum studies, that's actually a huge issue. There's a very important scholar who's now working for Boris Johnson in the conservative government in Britain. Her name is Dr. Mirza. And whatever your political leanings in terms of British politics are, she has a very interesting book that I just read called The Politics of Culture, and she describes a museum in East London where a large portion of the population is either poor white folks or poor Bangladeshis.
Mm-hmm.
And the museum wanted to try and create a museum for the local population, and they really struggled because they didn't get that much. It was rejecting the elite canonical culture of the British arts world, that is, the British Museum, the National Gallery, and they said, we're going to be different. We're going to be for these local East Londoners. But they still had this elitism that they struggled with. And so I think that these kinds of issues of, do you go with the canon or do you get rid of the canon? It is something that's affecting everyone and every discipline.
And I'm not here making some sort of argument about, look, we got to have the canon, teach the canon. That's it. That's not really my argument.
I'm okay with making that argument.
And we can have that discussion sometime. But I think my point simply is that what's been hard for me doing research has been this sort of subtle pressure of trying to demonstrate to colleagues and stuff, look, what I'm doing, it's different. It's going to push the boundaries of what we do. And I'm like, I don't really know if I can make that case, because what ultimately interests me most, one of the reasons you and I have been doing this podcast for so long, is to take the stuff that I think is truly beautiful and interesting and related to people who are not in the field. And one of the things that makes me sad sometimes in a lot of humanities departments is I see a ton of scholars who really are not remotely interested in making their research or anything relatable. I know multiple professors who will say things like, "Man, I hate teaching. It's just ugh." And I think, that why are you here?
Why
like,
are you? Why?
Go
why
write
did you
a
become
book.
a teacher?
But yeah, exactly. There's if all you are is a quote unquote researcher, what you're actually saying is you want people, your colleagues who you like, to appreciate what you do. Everyone else, well.
And I've actually found that those professors who go, I hate teaching. I really just want to do research. Generally, those are also the worst researchers. They can't speak to an audience past their own kind of parapet, and they can't. They don't get out amongst even the quote unquote masses in academia. They only speak about one specific, very tiny field.
Yeah, and I think if you were to, you could bring this back to the whole point of this discussion, which was the year kind of in review. For me, that's been, the whole year for me has been really an awakening for me of, this is what I want to do. I want to teach. I don't want to have to do research. I want to do things like podcasts. I want to offer eventually some online courses for people who just want to learn about Chinese literature in general, or just the 20th century, something. And to do it in a way that people can access, because if there is sort of a crisis in the humanities, it's that too many people have forgotten that, look, the humanities were always things that people talked about in a non-professional setting. You had salons, you had people sharing books. The French Revolution, people would gather around whoever had a newspaper and knew how to read it. Yeah, that was when the humanities. Well, that's when the humanities thrived. They're still thriving.
Bring it to China. I mean, the Tang Dynasty was all people sitting around discussing poetry, getting drunk. That was party was poetry plus alcohol plus literary discussion, right? Like. Right. Which is essentially what our podcast is.
Yeah, it is, basically. And this is the year in review again. This is kind of where you and I have both kind of landed. I said kind of twice. I hate doing that. Is looking around and going, okay, look, we're not going to say, let's just drop all the universities in the country into the trash and close the bin, right? We're not saying that. But there is a real crying need for platforms that take some of the really cool stuff from the humanities that you learn in grad school and other places, and taking them out of the university, right? Like there's some great stuff here that, the tensions between China and the U.S., part of that, I think, is due to the fact that most people have zero real awareness of the variety in Chinese culture and the different things that Chinese culture offers besides just state-run economics or communism.
And I think the thing you and I are both struggling over, and we kind of fall onto two different sides of this debate, is can you do this? Can you change scholarship? Can you change academia from within the ivory tower? Or do you have to get outside the ivory tower and fire
broadsides at
cannonballs?
There
we go.
CANON Lee balls. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, this is you and I are finishing our dissertations. We're both going to be defending in the next sometime in the coming calendar year. Yeah, me probably in the spring. So we're getting out one way or the other. We both have varying levels of enthusiasm for getting back in, but one of the things that
I guess we should make clear. I'm more enthusiastic than you are about academia.
I'm less enthusiastic. It's
but we're both kind of contemplating what happens in a post-COVID world where does academia change? And you and I have discussed writing a book. You and I have discussed kind of providing curricula or lesson plans for teachers who are interested in talking about China, don't know that much about China and need some help from someone who does know, because China is this weird thing. Hegel talks. Yeah, we've got to bring in Hegel, don't we?
Yeah, we're humanists. Hegel has to come in there somewhere.
Hegel talks about how China's kind of outside of the march of time, and I feel like, that's a ridiculous argument in some ways. But in American academia, China is outside the march of the mainstream.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, Brandon, who's been on this podcast several times, has said that his advisor who does work on China has told him, it's not fair, and speaks to the Eurocentricity of the academy. But if you're working on China and you're outside of China studies, if you're in sociology, if you're in comparative literature, then you always have to take on this extra burden of explaining not just your project, but why China? Why is China important? Right. And one of the things that we were thinking about doing with these lesson plans that we would,
or the book, or
just
eventually some
anything
courses.
We do, but things that we would want, products we would want to offer, things we would want to sell to people, is that we would be that kind of medium where we transmit this knowledge of China to the wider public.
Right. If you want to know about China, but you don't know where to start, we would hope that we're the people you start with, right? And really, in the coming year, we already have 2 big series already planned. You and I are currently designing a bit of curriculum for someone who contacted the podcast, more or less about this. We are working on a book. I would love to eventually transition into doing some formal online teaching courses. So anyway, those are things we're thinking about for the upcoming year, and make sure you stay tuned. There, this year was full of changes in the podcast and life and everything else. The coming year likely going to be the same. So
we're really happy that people wrote in and let us know that they wanted to binge on our podcast, and we should allow for more than the past 10 episodes. Because if you had not done that, we would not have actually known that there was a problem. So we appreciate that. Please binge on all over the Christmas break.
And, we'll be doing these plugs more often, but keep in touch with us. We're on Twitter at ChinLitPod, Chinese Literature Podcast, ChinLitPod. Instagram at ChineseLitPod. And we are now a proud member of the Patreon family. So if you're thinking to yourselves, you know what, these guys don't currently have high-paying tenure-track positions waiting for them, we should just send them a bunch of money. That should be where you go.
Buy us a beer.
Buy us a beer. We'll take that too. We're cheap dates. Chinese Literature Podcast at Patreon. And of course, Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com. That's the email address.
And, if you have any thoughts on how the podcast could do better, anything you really love about the podcast,
more of something,
more, even like a topic that we've missed, we know we've missed Hong Lamang Dream.
We're going to get to that at some point. Trust us.
We're working on that. It's just such a kind of big.
It's a behemoth.
I was going to say big cojones to bite off, but I don't think that's the right.
I don't think you want to go with that phrase. Absolutely not.
It's a big sandwich you have to eat.
Yes.
So let us know if you have thoughts on, the ideas that we were tossing out. If you're interested in maybe talking with us about a lesson plan, we'd love to hear from you.
All right. Let's go ahead and end it there.
All right. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.